Welcome to episode 120 of 10 Minute Record Reviews. This time I'm going to talk about Rod Stewart's debut album from late 1969, known as the Rod Stewart album in the United States, and known as An Old Raincoat Won't Ever Let You Down in the UK. I have a 1971 repress of this, an American repress previously owned by somebody called Swope, who affixed his or her name on there with a Sharpie. Nice gatefold cover. And a reminder, if you haven't subscribed to my channel, please do so. I do appreciate it. This is Rod Stewart's first album. It's very much Rod Stewart, clearly that, but it's Rod, not the polished Rod, if that's a term we can use, that we would expect from later years. There are glimpses of the mastery that's soon going to emerge, and the personnel and the musical formula are basically the same, but they haven't quite got it right here. So Rod Stewart was born in Archway, North London in 1945. His dad's Scottish, his mum's English. Rod had sort of a classic history as a UK rocker. He got turned on to rock and roll by Elvis and Little Richard and so on. Then, of course, he joins the skiffle group, right? How Spinal Tap is that. He becomes very interested in the folk music revival of the early 1960s. British artists like Ewan MacColl, but also Americans like Woody Guthrie and also Bob Dylan, whose first album comes out in 1962. He learns to play the harmonica, he makes money busking, and then he travels to Europe and he goes to Spain and France and he lives rough for a year or so, busking and seeing the sights. Eventually he gets deported by the Spanish police for being a vagrant, and so he arrives back in England in 1963. One thing which was characteristic with Rod about this time was that he was changing his look, his dress, his associations based on the current trends of the day. So in 1963 he leaves folk music behind and becomes a mod. Being a mod, of course, went hand in hand with R&B music, and Stewart gets heavily into Sam Cooke at this point, someone who would be a lasting influence on his career. In late 63, Stewart joined his first serious musical outfit, a band called The Dimensions, and they regularly played a club called Studio 51, which also regularly hosted the Stones, and so this gave Stewart an opportunity to watch Mick Jagger both play harmonica and also conduct himself as a frontman. Stewart left The Dimensions over a battle of egos, and soon joined up with Long John Baldry. He'd been to see Baldry play, and on the way home he was at a train station, and he pulled out a harmonica and he was playing Smokestack Lightning on the platform. Baldry hears him, invites him to come and gig, and when he finds out he can sing as well, he basically signs him up to be part of Baldry's outfit at that point, the Hoochie Coochie Men. Due to his growing presence as a frontman, his voice, his harmonica playing, and also his appearance, Stewart began to get top billing with the Hoochie Coochie Men as Rod the Mod. They had a weekly residence at the Marquee Club, which was another place the Stones were regularly gigging, kind of the epicenter of the R&B scene in London at the time. And he's scouted by Decca, and in 1964, he signed to a solo contract. With Decca, he releases a series of singles in 1964, 65, and 66. The first of these is Good Morning Little Schoolgirl, a single which featured future Zeppelin member John Paul Jones on bass. Sadly, that failed to chart, and so did all of the other singles that Stewart did for Decca. In the middle of this period, Baldry and Stewart decided to form an outfit called Steam Packet. Steam Packet was modeled on Ike and Tina Turner's Soul Review, and the idea was it was basically blue-eyed soul, a bunch of different musicians, people rotating in and out, taking lead singing and different instrumentation and so on. Rod hadn't necessarily enjoyed a lot of commercial success yet, musically, but he was getting a lot of notoriety in London, and in 1965 he was also the subject of a 30-minute documentary focusing on the whole mod scene, and it was entitled An Easter with Rod. His first big break happens in 1967, when Jeff Beck basically implodes in the Yardbirds. Beck's out on his own now, and he needs to form a new group of musicians. So he gets hold of Nicky Hopkins on piano, Mickey Waller, the drummer from Steam Packet, on drums. Ronnie Wood is lined up as the bass player, and Beck then reaches out to Stewart to join on vocals. Suffice it to say, they had tons of talent, they produced some great music, but any group led by Beck is inherently going to be unstable, and that's how it proved. Stewart sticks around for 2 albums, but the breaking point is when Beck comes to him and says that he wants to fire Wood on bass and Waller on drums, and Stewart's response is, "These guys are the tightest rhythm section I've ever played with, what are you thinking?" Beck proceeds anyway, and Stewart follows his friends out the door. By this point, he and Wood are very tight. However, just as Stewart is closing one door in 1969, 2 others are opening, because another great band is breaking up, the Small Faces, because Steve Marriott, the singer and guitarist, is leaving to form Humble Pie. So the Small Faces reach out to Ron Wood to come in on guitar and bass, and to Rod Stewart to come in on vocals. So Stewart and Wood join the Small Faces, who have to change their name now to Faces because Stewart and Wood, unlike the rest of the Small Faces, aren't small. But this creates problems for Rod because just prior to all this, he had signed terms with Mercury Records for a solo contract. So now he has to juggle a solo career and a band career. When this album was recorded, it's produced by Lou Reisner, the American A&R guy who was the head of Mercury Records' European operations, who had signed Stewart to a solo contract. Despite his influential position in Stewart's career and his background in Mercury Records, Reisner had not actually produced that many well-known artists at the time. So I find myself wondering about the dynamics in the control room, and I think that matters in this album because there are a lot of decisions where a sterner producer might actually have dissuaded the band from making some of the decisions which ultimately show up on the record. The lineup on the album includes Stewart on vocals. He also plays acoustic guitar on one track. Ronnie Wood on guitar and bass. Mick Waller plays drums. Martin Pugh, who had also spent time with Steamhammer, was on guitar. Martin Quittenton, who was another Steamhammer alum, was on acoustic guitar. And Ian McLagan, his new bandmate with the Faces, was on piano and organ. This album basically gives you the template which you're going to get really for the next 4 or 5 Rod Stewart albums. It's a mixture of folk, R&B, and rock and roll. And although that formula wouldn't propel this album to the heights that the following albums would reach, the sound of the band is distinctive as hell, particularly Wood on guitar and Waller on drums. And I would say it's probably no coincidence that when he finally stops playing with these guys in the mid-70s, critically, his career takes a total nosedive. As I've suggested though, even though the lineup is great and the musical formula is good, there are still some pretty major faults with this album. And most of them have to do with pretty heavy-handed and ill-advised choices made at the production level. I'll talk about some of the missteps in the individual songs in a second, but I will just say overall that Stewart himself says that he chose the wrong songs for this record. He did not pick songs to suit his voice. He picked songs that could show that he could do it all, and the conclusion that you kind of come to from this record is that actually he can't. The album begins with one of those missteps, Street Fighting Man. The first half of the song is Rod singing the lyrics, but not the melody, the Street Fighting Man, over top of a backing track which is not that song at all. Halfway through the song they switch to a more traditional cover, which I actually don't think is that well executed in any event. It's just a strange way to begin. It seems a bit half-baked, and ironically, it actually includes a future Stones guitarist. The next song is a traditional song, Man of Constant Sorrow, and redemption is at hand because the idea here is much clearer than whatever ideas they had for the opening track. This is basically Rod and acoustic guitar singing a folk song, and all the beauty and intimacy and tenderness of his voice and the honesty of emotion that he was able to conjure up so easily in those early years is present right here. The next song is the first original by Stewart, Blind Prayer. This is a bit of a miss. It's kind of verbose. Stewart seems to shout every verse, and some of it is almost a little bit cringy. He'd kind of nail this later on, like if you think about what he does on Reason to Believe or other great tracks in a couple of albums' time, he can adopt these folksy, country, homey kind of personae, and he really nails it. Here, he absolutely doesn't nail it. It's just kind of awkward, kind of cringy. So far on side one, we've been down, we've been up, we've been down, and now we're back up again with maybe the highlight of the whole record, Handbags and Glad Rags, which is a cover of a Mike Dabo tune. The contrast here between what is really a very good piece of songwriting and some of the novice efforts by Stewart is kind of stark, and what's also incredible is that little lick on piano, which if you remember nothing else from this whole record, you listen to that little tinkly bit from Dabo. It's fantastic. Side 2 starts with another Stewart original, An Old Raincoat Won't Ever Let You Down. He's not quite there with his songwriting. He's not really there with his phrasing either. There's just too much competition between Rod and the band. If ever there were a song which needed a stronger producer, it's this one. And speaking of the producer, Lou Reisner, now we move on to Stewart's next original, I Wouldn't Ever Change a Thing. There's 2 guest stars in this song because Emerson also plays organ here. Reisner sings this duet with Stewart about halfway through. He hasn't got the greatest voice, but somehow I'm actually kind of fond of this moment, even though the song itself is not that strong. It just needed a rewrite and a rethink. The next song is the last Stewart original, and that's Cindy's Lament. This has a great riff, but otherwise this is just another case of Rod trying too hard and not really getting his phrasing right. The last song is a cover of Ewan MacColl's Dirty Old Town. This is by some distance the best song on side 2, even though it does have a few issues. Ron Wood chips in on harmonica. The dynamics of this song are not really what they could be. Taking a step back and looking at Rod's debut album, you have to say this is very much to be filed under work in progress. He clearly has talent. He's often trying too hard, but strangely in other places where he could be more dynamic, he chooses not to be. He just hasn't quite found the path yet. He's relying on his tone, and that's not really getting it by. He's surrounded with a great group of musicians, and he's clearly still progressing, but this basically is an album with 3 good songs and a bunch of others that missed the mark. So for me, it's a 3 out of 5.